In this video, we look at most asked Docker interview questions along with answers and practical examples to help you clear your DevOps interviews. Let's go. Alright, so I'm here on my computer screen and I have this document which mostly includes the scenario based Docker interview questions. But there are also advanced level Docker interview questions like CICD with Docker, multi-stage Docker builds, how do you create them, upgrading Docker containers, volumes, networks, and a lot more. So make sure you watch this video till the end. And if you want me to share this document with you, comment down Docker interview questions and I will share this document as a PDF on LinkedIn as I shared the Terraform interview questions and answers. If you haven't checked out the Terraform interview questions and answers that I uploaded previously, make sure to check it out and let's start with this Docker interview questions and answers video. Let's go. So whenever you sit for a Docker interview or maybe any tools interview, the first question usually is, what is your experience with that particular tool? Similarly, the question here is, can you describe a situation where you use Docker to solve a specific problem? In this question, you need to explain how you use Docker in your previous projects or how has Docker helped you. So the answer would be something like, yes, in a recent project we faced inconsistency issues between development and production environments leading to deployment errors. To solve this, we adopted Docker and deployed the application with Kubernetes. So here you have defined that you have inconsistency issues in different environments like deployment and production. So you use Docker to have a consistent environment and you deployed that application using Kubernetes. So this is how you should be sharing your experience of how you used Docker in the past, just to give an idea that you actually know Docker and you have used it. So the follow-up question would be, can you explain how Docker containers differ from virtual machine? So we all know Docker containers are lightweight compared to virtual machines because here you just have your application with your dependencies, whereas in virtual machine you deploy a complete operating system. So Docker containers share the host OS kernel, making them lightweight and efficient. They provide process level isolation and package application with their dependencies. Whereas virtual machines run full guest operating systems on a hypervisor and consume more resources and offer strong isolation. So here is the difference. Here we only have our application. Here we have the complete operating system. We only have process level isolation. Here we have stronger isolation. So moving on, the next question, which is a scenario based question. You are in charge of maintaining Docker environments in your company and you have noticed many stopped containers and unused networks taking up space. Describe how you would clean up these resources effectively to optimize Docker environment. So in this question, the question is saying you have unused networks and also stopped Docker containers which are taking up space. You want to delete them to free up some space. How you can do it? So we can do this using Docker prune command. Docker prune command can be used to delete images, can be used to delete volumes, containers and lot more. So if I show you right now, I have these 4 images in my machine and if I want to delete all of them at once, I can just run docker image prune command. When I run this, it will give me a warning saying this will remove all dangling images. Similarly, you can also use docker prune with container to delete all the different containers which are stopped. You can also use docker volume prune to delete unused volumes, network, image and lot more. If you want to delete everything, you can use docker system prune command, which combines these functionalities into one command, ensuring that Docker removes any resources not associated with a running container. But when you run this docker system prune, make sure you know that it permanently deletes unused resources and any data associated with them will be lost. So always be cautious when running this command in production. There is also example of how docker system prune works. So moving on, the next question is, you are working on a project that requires Docker container to persistently store data. How do you handle persistent storage in Docker? So we all know Docker has volumes which you can use or attach to different containers to persist data. So here the answer is, Docker volumes can be used for persistent storage. They are managed by Docker and can be attached to one or more containers. You can see the diagram here. We have volumes which are attached to one or more containers. Another approach is to use bind mounts which are linked to host file systems. So you can also use bind mounts to persist data. And if you want to learn more, you can check out this link here which explains how you can persist data in Docker containers. The next question is, a company wants to create thousands of containers. Is there a limit on how many containers you can run in Docker? So there is actually no limit when running Docker containers. The only limit is the hardware limit or the machine limit. If the machine does not have enough CPU, it will not be able to run the container. So the answer here is the amount of containers that may be run under Docker has no explicit specified limit, but it all relies on the constraints. Particularly the hardware constraints is the size of the program and the number of CPU resources available are two major determinants. If your program isn't too large and you have plenty of CPU resources, we can run a lot of Docker containers. Which means if you have a machine with 10 CPUs and 10 GB of RAM, you can run as many containers as you want, which is in the limit of 10 CPUs and 10 GB RAM. If it's more than that, you will not be able to run. So now that you understood this, the follow-up question is a scenario-based question where you are managing a Docker environment and need to ensure that each container operates within defined CPU and memory limits. How do you limit the CPU and memory usage of a Docker container? So in this question, they are asking you to create a Docker container that should be using only defined CPU, which might be 10 CPUs or 2 CPUs, and then defined memory limit as well. So you can actually do this using the docker run command, passing out dash dash CPU and dash dash memory argument. So Docker allows you to limit the CPU and memory usage of a container using resource constraints. You can set the CPU with the dash dash CPU option and the memory with the dash dash memory option. Here is an example of Docker run dash dash CPU equals to 2, memory equals to 1 GB, and then my container. Memory equals to 1G and then my container. This is how you can limit how much CPU and memory should be used by the container. Moving on, the next question is, what is a Docker file and how it is used in Docker? So we already know Docker file is a text-based document that includes commands and instructions on how you want your Docker image to be. So we have this Docker file, then we build an image, and then we run a container. Here is an example of a Docker file which includes some instructions. So we have from node, which defines the base image, work directory, copy, run, and then CMD. Most of the questions in the interviews will be based on the instructions inside this Docker file. So make sure you understand what is from and what it does, what is work dir command, what is copy instruction, what is run instruction, and so on. So if you want to know more on these instructions, I have a video created which you can check here. And in this video, I've explained all different Docker instructions and how they work with a hands-on demo. So make sure you check it out. And this is why the follow-up question is, what is the purpose of CMD instruction in the Docker file? So as you can see here, CMD instruction here is running the command npm start, which will run whenever the container is started. So this command is going to start the node application. CMD is used to execute a command that will run whenever the application is started or the container is started. So here you can see the CMD instruction in Docker file specifies the default command to be executed when the container is started from a Docker image. It defines the primary functionality of a container, such as running an application as here, or executing a script. If the Docker container is started without a command, the command defined in CMD will be executed. So this is what CMD does. Moving on, the next question is a scenario-based question again. You have been asked with ensuring the application can handle increased loads by scaling Docker containers horizontally. How do you scale Docker containers horizontally? So scaling Docker containers horizontally means running multiple Docker containers. So you can actually do this using a container orchestration tool such as Kubernetes. Inside Kubernetes, you can define a manifest file specifying you want to have 5 replicas of this particular image. So it will run the same application 5 times. So you can see here, to scale Docker containers horizontally, you can use Docker Swarm or container orchestration tool like Kubernetes, which lets you create and manage multiple Docker containers, defining the number of replicas in declarative way, which is using manifest files. And if you don't know how it is done, you can check out these videos or projects where I've used Kubernetes using Docker containers. So you can go and check out these videos. I would highly recommend you doing the projects if you haven't done it. There are 4 different projects on Kubernetes using Docker. There are also more projects on my channel, so make sure to check this out and also do it yourself. Now the next question is, what is the difference between a Docker container and a Kubernetes pod. So Kubernetes pod is a Kubernetes object. Docker container is where your application is running. A Kubernetes pod is something that will contain one or more Docker containers. So this is the difference. If you see here, this is a pod inside a particular node in the Kubernetes cluster, and inside this pod you have a container. You can have one or more than one container. So a Docker container is a lightweight and isolated environment that runs a single instance of the application, and it is managed by Docker and provides process level isolation. Whereas a Kubernetes pod is a higher level abstraction, and that can contain one or more Docker containers, or it could be also other containers from other runtime like Cryo. Deploying a microservices architecture using Docker containers. One of the containers critical to the system's functionality has suddenly started failing without clear error messages. How do you debug issues in a failing Docker container? And this is very important interview question, and there is a high chance you will get this question because you need to know how to debug issues for a failing Docker containers. You can do this first by logging. You can use the Docker log command to check logs for a failed container or any container. You can also use shell access, like you can go inside the container using the docker exec command to see what is the problem. Alternatively, you can also use image inspect command. So if I show you right now, I have docker images, I have the survey image. If I want to see what is inside this or inspect this, I can just say docker image inspect and the name of the image, which is surveyor. Once I do this, it will give me all the layers, and this can also help me troubleshoot or debug any issues in my container. Lastly, there's also health checks. Docker supports defining health checks for containers, allowing you to monitor the health status and automatically restart or take action based on predefined conditions. Apart from this, you can also use different tools like Prometheus, Grafana, or also logging tools like Loki to see what is the problem with your Docker container. Moving on, the next question is, can you describe a situation where you optimized a Docker file for faster build times or smaller image size? Again, a very important question because because a DevOps engineer needs to know how to optimize images to make it shorter or to make it run properly. So optimizing Docker file could involve various strategies like using a smaller base image, mostly Alpine images, reducing the number of layers by combining commands, or using multi-stage builds to exclude unnecessary files from the final image. So these are different strategies you can use. You can use smaller base images. You can avoid using multiple instructions inside your Docker file. You can try to use just one run command and put all the commands you want to run rather than having them multiple times. And then you can also use multi-stage builds. So this is how you can optimize your images to make So multi-stage Docker build is something like this. In a Docker file, we have multiple from instructions. Every from instruction defines a stage. So you can see here, multi-stage builds in Docker allow you to create optimized Docker images by leveraging multiple build stages. To create a multi-stage build, you define multiple from instructions. As you can see, there are two from instruction, which means there are two stages here. And then if you want to pass in some artifacts, you can do that using copy command. So each stage can use different base image and perform specific build steps. Intermediate build artifacts can be copied between stages using the copy -- from instruction. So this is how you can create multi-stage builds in Docker. Moving on, the next question is, how do you create a custom Docker network? So we have Docker network command to create custom networks, which is like this here. So to create a custom Docker network, you can use the Docker network create command followed by the desired network name. And I've also explained this properly in the Docker video. If you haven't checked it out, I've also shared notes where all these commands are listed down, so you can also check that out. If you want me to share it again, let me know in the comment section. So this is a command which can create a network, which will be a custom network, and you can also define the driver using the -- driver option. So moving on, the next question is, you are working on a critical application running in Docker containers and update needs to be applied without risking data loss. So how do you update a Docker container without losing data? So you have a container which you want to update, but there's also some data inside it. You don't want the data to be deleted. How do you update the Docker container without any data loss? So the steps are, first take the backup of whatever is there inside the container. Once you have the backup, then stop the container, pull the new image or the new update of the container and then run it. So here is the steps. Create the backup, stop the container using docker stop command, pull the latest version using docker pull, start the new container with the updated image and make sure everything is working fine. Then you can map the volume of the backup that you have taken, and then if you can verify if everything is working fine with the data inside the container. So this is how you can update without any data loss. Moving on, the next question is, you are responsible for securing Docker containers hosting your organization's sensitive application. How do you secure Docker containers? Security is a very important thing for organizations, so make sure you know how to secure your Docker containers. And here we have some best practices on how you can secure Docker containers. So the first best practice is to use trusted base images from reputable sources. Always make sure to use trusted images. Second is to regularly update Docker and its underlying host system for security patches. Next, to scan your Docker images for vulnerabilities using tools like Docker Scout, which is a tool by Docker itself. Then implementing network segmentation and access control, monitoring container activity and logging for security analysis using different tools, and then applying the least privilege principle. So here are some of the best practices to make sure you have a secure Docker container or an application running on these Docker containers. Moving on, the next question is Docker with CICD. So have you used Docker in combination with continuous integration or continuous deployment system? This should be yes all the time, because no one wants a DevOps engineer who does not know how to create Docker images through CICD. So we will answer it in a way, yes. In nearly all my projects, for example in one project we integrated Docker with Jenkins. In the build stage, Jenkins would trigger a job that builds a new Docker image and pushes it to Docker registry. During the deployment stage, this image was pulled from the registry and deployed to Docker and deployed to production environment using Kubernetes. This approach ensured uniformity across all stages. So this is how you should answer it. Using CI/CD, you are also creating the image and also deploying it on Kubernetes. So that's how you can use CI/CD with Docker. Moving on, the next question is, how is Docker used in AWS? So again, if you're a DevOps engineer, you need to have knowledge of one cloud with Docker. It could be AWS, Azure or GCP. So I'm using AWS here. The answer would be similar as well. So in my previous project, we used Docker with AWS using Amazon ECS service. So ECS is a service that lets you run your Docker containers. It's also a container orchestration service in AWS. So we deployed our microservices as Docker containers on ECS, which enabled us to efficiently manage the lifecycle of these services. We also used AWS Fargate for serverless compute of our containers. This is how you should be answering when you have a question on how is Docker used within AWS. Next question is, how do you monitor Docker containers? So you can monitor Docker containers either using Docker commands or using open source tools like Prometheus, Grafana, etc. So you can use built-in container monitoring commands like Docker stats, Docker container stats, Docker top, etc. You can also use tools like Prometheus, Grafana or ELK stack. You can also use Kubernetes or other container orchestration API or built-in tools. Or you can also use specialized monitoring agents or tools that provide container level insights. This can be something like CloudWatch agents. You can install CloudWatch agents on the containers and then get the metrics on CloudWatch dashboards. So these are different ways on how you can monitor Docker containers. Make sure to read it out. And if you want me to share this document, again comment down Docker interview questions and I'll share this document which can help you prepare for your Docker interviews. Now the next question is, what are some best practices for using Docker in production environments? Again, very important, and you need to know this before going for Docker interviews. So some best practices here are, always build and use lightweight containers. to improve deployment speed and reduce attack surface. Regularly update Docker and underlying host, we already covered that. Implement container orchestration platforms like Kubernetes to manage containers at scale. Uh, Configure resource limits for containers to prevent resource contention. We have seen how you can use dash dash CPU and dash dash memory to limit how much CPU and memory should be used by the container. Monitor container health, resource usage to make sure everything is working fine. Implement secure network configuration using private networks, and we know how to create custom networks using the network create command. Backup data which are critical for you using volumes and storage solutions. Implement comprehensive security strategy including container vulnerability scanning, access controls, and least privilege principle. You have different tools like Docker Scout to do that. So these are different best practices when using Docker in production environments. Now the next question is, how do you use Docker with Kubernetes? This is already known now. We have a container, and if you have multiple containers that you want to manage, we can use container orchestration tool such as Kubernetes. Kubernetes provides us with many different benefits like load balancing, scaling, management, and lot more. So Docker can be used with container runtime within a Kubernetes cluster. When deploying applications in Kubernetes, Docker is responsible for creating and managing containers on each node. Kubernetes uses Docker API to interact with Docker and perform container related operations such as pulling images from registries or creating containers or managing the lifecycle. So this is how Docker can be used with Kubernetes. When you have multiple Docker containers, you use a container orchestration tool like Kubernetes to manage all of them. Now moving on, can you describe a situation where you have used Terraform to automate the deployment of Docker containers? Again, the answer should be yes. So the answers would be something like this. In a recent project, we used Terraform to automate the deployment of our Docker containers on AWS. We defined our infrastructure code using Terraform, which included our ECS service and tasks. This task specified the Docker images to be used, pulled from ECR or Elastic Container Registry. All of this done through Terraform, and the resources allocated to each container. Whenever we made changes to our Terraform scripts, we could easily apply these changes to update our infrastructure in AWS Cloud. So answer should be something like this, where you're using Terraform to create ECS clusters or services or tasks, etc. Now the last question is, how do you implement canary deployments with Docker and Kubernetes? So in the previous Terraform interview questions, we covered the blue-green deployment. Here we have canary deployment. So what is a canary deployment? A canary deployment is a strategy where you have one version and then you have another version. So you put some traffic on the new version to make sure if everything is working, and then if everything is working, you put out all the traffic to that version. So here, how can you implement canary deployments using Docker and Kubernetes? You can do that by first setting up a cluster and then deploying your application using Docker container. Once you have that, you can then release the new version or create a new deployment, a service for. So these are all the questions for our Docker interview. I hope this video was informative. If you have any questions, any doubt, do let me know in the comment section. If you want me to share this document, do let me know in the comment section as well. And if you want me to cover more such interview questions on Kubernetes, let me know in the comment box. Thank you and have a good day.